The veterinary clinic on Route 14 had seen countless heartbreaks, but nothing compared to the sight of 83-year-old Constance Merriweather holding her orange tabby Hemingway, while the receptionist quietly slid a surgery estimate across the counter. $3,400. The number might as well have been 3 million. Connie's hands trembled as she stroked Hemingway's fur, knowing the tumor growing inside him would kill him within weeks without intervention. She had survived a husband's death, a daughter's abandonment, and the slow erasure of her savings to medical bills. But losing Hemingway, her last companion in a silent house, felt like losing the final thread connecting her to the world. What she didn't know was that Rowan Ironside Cade had been sitting 3 chairs away, waiting for his own dog's checkup results. The 67-year-old president of the Alliance for Freedom always had heard every word. He'd watched Connie's shoulders shake as she whispered to her cat that she was sorry. He'd seen her walk out into the parking lot, climb into a rusted Ford pickup, and sit there for 20 minutes without starting the engine. Rowan had made his fortune in construction, lost his son to opioids, and found purpose leading a brotherhood of riders who believed in old codes. Protect the vulnerable, honor your word, and never let the silent ones suffer alone. By that evening, Rowan had made 11 phone calls. By midnight, word had spread through 3 states. By dawn, 101 AFFA bikers were checking their fuel tanks and tightening their straps. They didn't know Constance Merriweather. They'd never met her cat. But they understood what it meant to be abandoned by a system that counted dollars before dignity. And they knew that sometimes the most powerful statement a person can make is showing up when no one else will. What happened over the next 4 days would become legend among riders from Montana to Tennessee, a story about how mercy rides louder than any engine, and how a woman who thought the world had forgotten her would discover that family isn't always blood. It's the strangers who refuse to let you fall. The fluorescent lights in Riverbend Animal Hospital hummed with the kind of sterile indifference that made everything feel colder. Constance Merriweather sat in the waiting area with Hemingway pressed against her chest, feeling his heartbeat through the thin fabric of her cardigan. 16 years they'd been together. 16 years since she'd found him as a kitten behind the dumpster at Harper's Grocery, his paw caught in fishing line, his eyes full of trust she hadn't earned yet. Dr. Patel had been gentle when she explained the diagnosis. A mass near the intestines, operable, but urgent. The surgery required a specialist, anesthesia monitoring, post-operative care. $3,400. Connie's Social Security check was $1,062 a month. Her mortgage ate $600. Utilities, another $180. Medication for her arthritis and blood pressure, $240. That left her with groceries, gas, and $42 she usually saved for emergencies. This was an emergency, but it was the kind that money couldn't stretch to meet. "I understand it's a significant amount," Dr. Patel had said, her voice soft with practiced sympathy. "We can discuss payment plans or—" She'd trailed off, the unspoken option hanging in the air like smoke. Euthanasia. $200. Connie had thanked her quietly and carried Hemingway to the front desk, where a young receptionist with purple-streaked hair slid the surgery estimate across the counter. The girl's eyes held pity. Connie hated pity almost as much as she hated the number staring back at her. She stood there for a moment, stroking Hemingway's ears, memorizing the way he rumbled against her palm. Behind her, a man's voice spoke to the receptionist about picking up medication. Normal life continuing while hers crumbled. If you're moved by Connie's story and want to see where faith leads, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this journey is just beginning. Outside, the November wind cut through the parking lot with the kind of sharpness that reminded Connie how thin her coat had gotten. She settled Hemingway into his carrier on the passenger seat and climbed behind the wheel of her 2004 Ford Ranger. The truck started on the third try, coughing exhaust into the grey afternoon. She didn't drive home. She just sat there, engine idling, watching people come and go with their healthy pets and their ability to afford miracles. Her daughter, Miranda, had moved to Phoenix 8 years ago and called twice a year. Her husband, Dell, had been gone for 12. The house on Oakmont Drive felt emptier with each passing season, but Hemingway had made it bearable. His presence meant she still had someone to talk to, someone who needed her. Now even that was being taken. Connie pressed her forehead against the steering wheel and allowed herself 60 seconds to cry. Then she straightened, shifted into reverse, and pulled out of the lot. She would take Hemingway home, she would feed him his favorite tuna, and she would figure out how to say goodbye. What she didn't see was the man in the leather vest, standing by his Harley near the clinic entrance, watching her truck disappear down Route 14. Rowan Cade had heard every word through the thin walls of the waiting room, and he'd already made his first phone call. Rowan Ironside Cade sat on the bench outside Riverbend Animal Hospital for another 10 minutes after Constance drove away, phone pressed to his ear, while his dog, Copper, waited patiently at his feet. The call connected on the second ring. "Grizz, I need you to spread the word." Grizz Whitmore, the AFFA's road captain and Rowan's closest friend for 30 years, didn't ask questions first. "How many we talking?" "Everyone within 500 miles who can ride. I need them in Ashford by Friday morning." There was a pause. Grizz knew Rowan didn't make calls like this for small things. "What happened?" Rowan told him, "about the old woman, the cat, the estimate that might as well have been a death sentence, about the way her hands had shaken when she tried to keep her voice steady at the counter, about the fact that she'd sat in her truck for 20 minutes like she couldn't remember how to go home. $3,400, Rowan said. That's what it costs to keep someone from losing the last thing they love." Grizz was quiet for a beat, then, "I'll make the calls. How we doing this?" "Fundraiser ride, Saturday morning. We collect donations, we cover the surgery, and we show up at her door so she knows she's not alone." "What's her name?" "Constance Merriweather. Lives on Oakmont Drive. I'll get you the address." Ironside," Grizz said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd ridden through bad weather and worse decisions alongside Rowan. "You know I'm in, but you also know not everyone's got extra cash right now. I'm covering half. I just need them to show up. Presence matters as much as money." That was the thing about Rowan Cade. He'd made his fortune building strip malls and medical centers across 3 states, but he'd never forgotten what it felt like to be broke. His father had been a coal miner who died at 54 with black lungs and empty pockets. His mother had cleaned houses until arthritis bent her fingers into claws. Rowan had built his empire brick by brick, and when his son, Ethan, died of a fentanyl overdose at 26, Rowan had sold half his assets and poured the money into veteran outreach programs and addiction recovery centers. The AFFA, Alliance for Freedom Always, had started as a riding club, but evolved into something more like a moral code on wheels. They didn't wear colors that claimed territory. They didn't run guns or drugs. They showed up when the system failed. They paid medical bills for homeless vets. They rebuilt houses after floods. They stood between predators and victims when the law moved too slow. And now they were going to make sure an 83-year-old woman didn't have to choose between groceries and her cat's life. By 7 that evening, Rowan's phone was buzzing non-stop. Riders from Ohio, Kentucky, West Virginia, and Tennessee were confirming. By 9, he had commitments from 83 bikers. By 11, the number hit 101. Grizz called back at midnight. "We're golden. Routes planned. Everyone's meeting at the truck stop off exit 42 at dawn Saturday. We ride in formation, we make noise, and we make sure Constance knows the world hasn't forgotten her." Rowan stood on his back porch, watching the stars through the skeletal branches of November trees. Copper sat beside him, warm and steady. He thought about Constance sitting in that parking lot, about the way her voice had cracked when she thanked the vet, about the fact that loneliness was its own kind of death, slower and quieter than disease. "Thanks, brother," Rowan said. "That's what we do," Grizz replied. "We ride for the ones who can't." Constance Merriweather woke Friday morning to the sound of Hemingway crying. Not his usual demanding yowl for breakfast, but a low, pained sound that made her heart clench. She found him in his bed by the radiator, curled tight, his breathing shallow. She knelt beside him, joints protesting, and stroked his head. "I know. Baby, I know it hurts." The vet had given her pain medication, but it only dulled the edges. The tumor was growing. Time was running out. Connie made oatmeal she didn't eat and sat at the kitchen table with cold coffee, staring at the stack of bills she'd been ignoring. Electric, water, property tax, the numbers blurred together. She'd called Miranda yesterday hoping, what? That her daughter would offer to help. Miranda had her own life. 2 kids, a mortgage, a husband who worked in tech. They were comfortable, but Connie hadn't raised her daughter to rescue her mother. She'd called anyway, left a voicemail. No response yet. She thought about calling the animal hospital to schedule euthanasia. Humane, painless, affordable. The words tasted like ash. Instead, she sat with Hemingway on her lap, feeling his weight, memorizing his warmth. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet. Oakmont Drive had once been full of families, children playing in yards, block parties in summer. Now most houses stood dark, owned by landlords who rented to tenants Connie never saw. She was the last original resident, the last memory of when this street had felt like home. Dell would have known what to do. He'd been good at fixing things, cars, leaky faucets, broken spirits. But Dell had been gone since 2013, and Connie had learned to fix things herself, or live with them broken. This, though, she couldn't fix this. By afternoon, she'd made her decision. She would call Monday morning and schedule the procedure. She would give Hemingway the weekend. She would let him lie in the sun that came through the living room window. She would feed him every treat he'd ever loved. And then she would let him go, because holding on when he was suffering wasn't love. It was selfishness. She told herself this was mercy. She didn't tell herself it felt like giving up. That evening, she sat on the porch with Hemingway wrapped in a blanket, watching the sky turn purple and gold. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked. A car passed, headlights sweeping across her yard. The world kept moving, indifferent to her small tragedy. Connie didn't know that 60 miles away, 101 motorcycles were being fueled and inspected. She didn't know that a man named Rowan Cade had spent 2 days organizing a convoy. She didn't know that by tomorrow morning her quiet street would fill with the sound of engines and the presence of strangers who'd decided she mattered. All she knew was that tonight she still had Hemingway. And tonight, that would have to be enough. And now I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact hour you heard this story. We wish to know how far these northern confessions travel and at what moments they reach you. Saturday morning broke cold and clear, the kind of November dawn that turned breath into fog and frost into glitter. At the truck stop off Exit 42, 101 motorcycles lined up in rows, their metal gleaming under halogen lights. Rowan stood at the front, helmet tucked under his arm, watching his brothers and sisters arrive. They came from everywhere. Grizz rolled in from Columbus with 15 riders behind him. A woman named Kestrel led a pack from Lexington. Veterans, construction workers, nurses, teachers, people who understood that the measure of a community wasn't its wealth, but its willingness to show up when someone fell. Rowan had briefed them via group text. Quiet approach until they reached Oakmont Drive, then full throttle. They wanted Constance to hear them coming. They wanted her to know this wasn't charity whispered in secret. It was solidarity announced with pride. "Formation riding," Rowan called out. "Two columns. Grizz takes left flank, Kestrel takes right. We keep it tight, we keep it respectful. And we don't stop until we're on her street." "What's the total?" someone shouted from the back. Rowan held up his phone, showing the fundraising app they'd been using since Thursday. $4,700. Surgeries covered, plus post-op care and medication. A cheer went up, the kind of sound that rattled windows and stirred something primal. These were people who'd been written off by society, dismissed as troublemakers or relics. But they knew what mattered, keeping promises, protecting the vulnerable, and proving that decency didn't die just because the world got harder. "Mount up!" Rowan shouted. The engines roared to life in sequence, a symphony of combustion and horsepower that rolled across the parking lot like thunder announcing a storm. They pulled out onto the highway in formation, two columns of metal and leather and purpose, heading toward Ashford with the rising sun at their backs. Constance was in the kitchen when she heard them. At first she thought it was a storm, that low, rolling rumble that precedes lightning, but storms didn't crescendo. They didn't get louder and closer until the windows rattled in their frames. She walked to the front door, Hemingway cradled in her arms, and stepped onto the porch. What she saw stopped her breath. Motorcycles, dozens of them, pouring onto Oakmont Drive in two perfect columns. Their engines a unified roar that echoed off the houses and shook the bare trees. They filled the street, filled her yard, filled the empty spaces where loneliness had lived. Riders in leather vests, helmets reflecting the morning light, faces marked by weather and years and choices that left scars. Constance stood frozen, unable to process what she was seeing. Were they lost? Was this some kind of rally that had taken a wrong turn? Then the engines cut off, one by one, until the street fell silent, except for the ticking of cooling metal. And a man stepped forward, tall, grey-bearded, with eyes that held both sorrow and determination. "Mrs. Merriweather?" Rowan said, removing his helmet. Connie nodded, unable to speak. "My name is Rowan Cade. I was at Riverbend Animal Hospital on Wednesday. I heard what happened with Hemingway." Her throat tightened. "I don't understand. We're the Alliance for Freedom always. We ride for people who need help but don't know how to ask. And we're here to make sure your cat gets his surgery." Connie looked at the sea of faces behind him, old men and young women, veterans and workers. People who'd driven hours to stand in her yard for a cat they'd never met. Her vision blurred. I don't have the money." "It's covered," Rowan said gently. $4,700. Surgery, recovery, medication. We took donations. Everyone here gave what they could." Connie's legs went weak. Grizz stepped forward and steadied her, his hand firm on her elbow. "Easy, ma'am. We got you." "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do this?" Rowan crouched slightly, meeting her eyes. "Because you shouldn't have to choose between hope and groceries. Because Hemingway matters. Because you matter. And because sometimes the only thing standing between despair and dignity is someone willing to show up." By noon, Hemingway was in surgery at Riverbend Animal Hospital. Dr. Patel working with the precision of someone who understood what this life meant. Constance sat in the waiting room, surrounded by 20 bikers who'd volunteered to stay while the others headed to a local diner. Kestrel, a woman in her 50s with silver streaks in her dark hair, sat beside Connie, holding her hand. "He's strong. He's going to pull through." "I don't know how to thank you," Connie said for the dozenth time. "You already have," Kestrel replied. "By letting us help, people forget that receiving is just as important as giving." 2 hours later, Dr. Patel emerged, mask pulled down, smile visible. "The surgery went well. We got clean margins. He'll need to stay overnight for observation, but I expect a full recovery." Connie broke down. Not the quiet tears she'd cried in her truck, but the deep, shaking sobs of someone who'd been holding the weight of the world and finally got permission to set it down. Kestrel held her while she cried, and the bikers around them simply waited, giving her the space to feel everything she'd been suppressing. When Connie finally composed herself, she looked around at these strangers who'd become something more. I lived 83 years, thinking the world had gotten too hard, too selfish. You proved me wrong. Rowan stepped forward. The world's exactly as good or bad as the people in it choose to make it. We chose good today, and we'll keep choosing it tomorrow. If this story touched your heart, hit that like button and let us know, because Hemingway's fight isn't over, and neither is Connie's story. Hemingway came home on Monday afternoon in a plastic carrier that smelled of antiseptic and fear. Dr. Patel carried him to Constance's truck personally, giving detailed instructions about medication schedules, wound care, and warning signs. Rowan and Grizz followed in their bikes, escorting Connie home like she was transporting royalty. Inside the house, Connie settled Hemingway into his bed by the radiator, the spot where sunlight pooled every morning and the old cast-iron heat hummed through winter nights. The cat was groggy from anesthesia, his orange fur slightly matted around the surgical site, a small patch shaved clean. But when she stroked his head, he purred. That rusty, rumbling sound that meant home and safety and survival. "He's tough," Rowan said from the doorway, watching Connie fuss over blankets and water bowls. 16 years old and still fighting. "Like his mother," Grizz added with a grin. Connie wiped her eyes. "I don't know what I would have done without you, any of you." "You'd have figured something out," Rowan said. "Strong people always do, but you don't have to figure things out alone anymore." That became apparent over the following days. The bikers didn't disappear after the surgery. They showed up in shifts, quietly integrating themselves into Connie's life like they'd always belonged there. Tuesday morning, Kestrel arrived with 3 canvas grocery bags filled with actual food, not just canned soup and instant coffee, but fresh vegetables, good bread, chicken breasts, and an apple pie from a bakery in Columbus. "You need real nutrition," she said, unpacking items into Connie's ancient refrigerator. "And so does Hemingway. Dr. Patel said high-protein diet during recovery." Wednesday, Grizz showed up with his toolbox and spent 4 hours fixing Connie's furnace, which had been making ominous clanking sounds since October. He replaced the igniter, cleaned the burners, and adjusted the thermostat. "This thing's older than my marriage," he muttered, "but it'll last another 5 years now." Thursday brought Flint, the youngest of the crew at 29, arms covered in intricate tattoos that told stories Connie didn't ask about. He measured the sagging deck, made notes, and returned Friday with lumber and a circular saw. By Saturday, Connie had a new deck that didn't creak ominously when she stepped outside. "You don't have to do all this," Connie kept saying. The words becoming a mantra she repeated to every biker who showed up with tools or groceries or just company. "We know," they'd reply, variations on the same theme. "We want to." Rowan came by Thursday afternoon with a folder, the kind with pockets and labelled tabs that suggested organisation Connie hadn't managed in years. Inside were contact numbers for senior services, information about Medicare supplemental plans, a list of local food banks, and volunteer opportunities for people who wanted to stay active. "You don't have to use any of this," he said, setting it on her kitchen table. "But having options means you're not trapped." Connie made coffee, real coffee, the good beans Kestrel had brought, and they sat while Hemingway dozed in a patch of afternoon sunlight, his breathing steady and strong. The surgical site was healing clean. His appetite had returned with feline vengeance. "Why do you do this?" Connie asked, not for the first time, but with the weight of someone who genuinely wanted to understand. "Really? You have businesses, families, lives. Why spend your time on a stranger and her cat?" Rowan was quiet for a moment, wrapping both hands around his mug. His fingers were scarred from decades of construction work, the kind of permanent marks that came from building things meant to last. When he spoke, his voice carried the texture of old grief worn smooth by time. I had a son, Ethan, sharp kid, full of life, wanted to be a paramedic. He graduated high school, got accepted to community college for the EMT program. Rowan paused, looking at something only he could see. He hurt his back working landscaping that summer. Doctor prescribed painkillers. By Christmas he was using heroin. By the following July he was dead, 26 years old. Oh, Rowan. Connie reached across the table, her arthritis-bent fingers closing over his scarred knuckles. I didn't see it, he continued. Didn't recognize the signs. Thought he was just stressed about school. When I finally understood what was happening, I tried to help, but he wasn't ready. And then one morning, his girlfriend called me because he wouldn't wake up. Fentanyl in the supply. He never had a chance. The kitchen clock ticked. Hemingway stretched in his sleep. I'm so sorry. Rowan nodded. Me too. Every single day. But I learned something, Connie. Being too late once means you show up early everywhere else. You don't wait for permission to help. You don't wonder if you're overstepping or if someone will be offended by charity. You just act. Because the worst thing in life isn't failing when you try. It's never trying because you're afraid of getting it wrong. Connie squeezed his hand tighter. Ethan would be proud of you. Rowan's eyes glistened. Maybe, or maybe he'd be laughing at his old man turning into a softy. Either way, I'm doing what I wish someone had done for him. I'm showing up before it's too late. And when I heard you in that clinic, talking to Hemingway about being sorry, it was like hearing my own voice the morning I found Ethan. That tone of someone who's about to give up because the system told them they don't matter enough to save. He looked at her directly. You matter, Connie. You and Hemingway, and everyone like you who falls through the cracks because the numbers don't add up. That's why we do this, not because we're heroes, because we're the people who got left behind once, and we refuse to let it happen to someone else. Connie felt something break open in her chest. Not pain, but release. The weight she'd been carrying since Dell died, since Miranda moved away, since the neighborhood emptied and the house got quieter. The burden of believing she'd become invisible. Thank you, she whispered, for seeing me. Always, Rowan said. The story spread the way truth does in small towns, through coffee shops and church basements, shared on social media by people who needed to believe goodness still existed. By Wednesday, a reporter from the Ashford Gazette had tracked down Constance's address, knocking politely and asking permission to write about the bikers who'd saved her cat. Connie almost said no. She'd spent 83 years avoiding attention, believing that people who made noise were either fools or narcissists. But Rowan encouraged her. Let them tell it, he said. Not for us, for the next person who's sitting in a parking lot trying to decide if hope is worth the risk. So Connie agreed. The reporter, a young woman named Jenna with kind eyes and a digital recorder, sat in the living room while Hemingway performed his post-surgery routine, demanding attention, knocking pens off the coffee table, and purring so loudly the recorder picked it up. The headline ran Friday, 101 Bikers Restore Faith, How AFFA Saved More Than a Cat. The article included photos. Connie on her new deck, Hemingway in her lap, Rowan and Grizz standing beside their motorcycles. A group shot of 20 bikers in their leather vests, arms crossed, faces weathered but smiling. The story detailed the surgery, the fundraiser, the community that had formed around an elderly woman most people had never noticed. By Monday, the article had been shared 3,000 times. By Wednesday, it had reached Tennessee, Michigan, and Oregon. Messages flooded the AFFA email account, some offering donations, others asking for help, many just wanting to say thank you for proving that decency hadn't died. A woman in Brookside County reached out through the website, explaining that her father, a 79-year-old Korean War veteran named Earl, couldn't afford his diabetes medication. His insurance covered part, but the co-pays were eating his retirement check. He'd started rationing insulin, taking less than prescribed, hoping he could stretch supplies until his next Social Security deposit. Grizz organized a pharmacy fundraiser within 48 hours. The club set up a booth outside Brookside Pharmacy, collected donations, and raised enough to cover 6 months of Earl's insulin plus glucose testing strips. When they delivered the supplies, Earl wept like a man who'd been holding back tears for years. "I fought for this country," he said, voice breaking, "and I couldn't afford to stay alive in it. You gave me my dignity back." Another message came from a teacher in Riverside, 20 miles south of Ashford. One of her students, a quiet 12-year-old named Marcus, had stopped coming to school. When she visited his family, she discovered they'd lost their rental house after the father's factory closed. They were living in their car, trying to hide the situation from social services for fear of losing Marcus to foster care. AFFA found them temporary housing through a veterans shelter program one of the members managed. They collected donations for furniture, clothes, and school supplies. Rowan personally drove Marcus to school for 3 weeks until the father found new work. When Marcus's birthday came in December, 15 bikers showed up with a cake, presents, and the kind of loud, joyful chaos that made the boy laugh for the first time in months. The convoy that had rolled down Oakmont Drive became a symbol larger than any single story. It proved that mercy wasn't dead, just hibernating in the hearts of people who needed a reason to wake it up. Every article shared, every message received, every person helped became another ripple spreading outward. Constance watched this unfold with a mixture of pride and bewilderment. She'd become the unlikely face of something she barely understood, proof that asking for help wasn't weakness, and that strangers could become family if you let them. Hemingway, oblivious to his role as catalyst, recovered with typical feline arrogance. He regained weight quickly, demanding breakfast at 5 a.m. with increasing volume. His fur grew back over the surgical site. His energy returned until he was climbing furniture and batting at dust motes with the enthusiasm of a kitten. Every yowl, every demanding headbutt, every moment of stubborn feline attitude was a gift Connie had thought she'd lost forever. Miranda finally called 2 weeks after the surgery, her voice tight with emotion Connie couldn't quite identify. "Mum, I saw the article someone shared on Facebook. Why didn't you tell me Hemingway was sick?" "You have your own life, honey. Your kids, your husband. I didn't want to burden you." "You're my mother." Miranda's voice cracked. "Your life is part of mine. I should have been there." They talked for an hour, the longest conversation they'd had in 5 years, not fixing old wounds, but acknowledging they existed. Not solving decades of distance, but admitting it hurt. Miranda promised to visit for Christmas. Connie didn't hold her breath, didn't let hope become expectation, but she allowed herself to believe it might happen. And belief, she'd learned, was the first step toward change. Spring came to Ashford with the slow, stubborn insistence of something that refuses to be rushed. Snow melted into mud, then mud dried into earth that cracked and softened under March rains. Flowers pushed through thawed ground, crocuses first, then daffodils, then the wild violets that Dell had always loved. Trees budded green, branches reaching toward longer days and warmer light. On Oakmont Drive, Constance Merriweather sat on her rebuilt deck. Hemingway sprawled across her lap like an orange-furred emperor surveying his domain. The cat had not only survived, but thrived, putting on weight until Dr. Patel joked about putting him on a diet. His energy had returned with aggressive enthusiasm. He hunted shadows at dawn, knocked objects off counters with scientific precision, and demanded attention at volumes that suggested he'd forgotten he was supposed to be elderly and dignified. Rowan and Grizz were installing a ramp alongside her front steps, power tools buzzing in the afternoon warmth. Kestrel sat in a folding chair nearby, drinking lemonade and offering unsolicited engineering advice that the men ignored with practiced patience. "You know I can still manage stairs," Connie called out, watching them measure angles and mark lumber. "For now," Rowan replied, not looking up from his drill. "But this way, when your knees get worse, you're already set. Plus, if you ever need a wheelchair or walker, you've got access. I'm 83, not 90, and we want you to make it to 100, Grizz said, securing a support beam, which means planning ahead. Connie shook her head, smiling despite herself. "You're all insufferable." "Yep," they replied in unison. The AFFA had become a permanent fixture in her life over the winter months. Not smothering, never intrusive, but consistently present in ways that transformed loneliness into community. They checked in weekly, sometimes just a text, sometimes a visit with groceries or an invitation to dinner. They'd included her in their fundraising plans, asking her opinion on cases that needed help. They'd made her the club's unofficial grandmother, the moral compass that reminded them why they did what they did. And Connie, who'd spent years believing she'd become invisible, discovered what it meant to be seen. Valentine's Day had brought 15 bikers to her door with flowers and chocolates, making her laugh until she cried. Easter arrived with a basket from Kestrel's grandchildren, who'd never met Connie, but knew she was Grandma Rowan's friend. Her birthday in April became an event. 30 people crammed into her small house, bringing food and music and the kind of chaos that made the walls feel alive again. Miranda had kept her Christmas promise. She'd driven up from Phoenix with her husband and kids, staying for 4 days that were awkward and honest and necessary. They didn't fix everything, but they started talking about Dell, about the distance, about the ways grief had pushed them apart instead of bringing them together. When Miranda left, she hugged Connie tightly and whispered, "I'm sorry I stayed away so long." "I'm sorry I let you," Connie replied. Now, as spring settled into its rhythm, Connie watched Rowan and Grizz finish the ramp. They'd painted it to match her porch, a soft grey that complemented the white railings. It was sturdy, wide, and built to last decades. "Come test it," Rowan said, offering his hand. Connie stood carefully, Hemingway protesting the movement before jumping down to investigate a butterfly. She walked down the ramp, feeling its solid construction beneath her feet. At the bottom, she turned and walked back up. Smooth, easy, safe. "It's perfect," she said. "Good. Now you've got no excuse not to come to the community dinners." Those dinners had become legendary. Monthly gatherings where AFFA members, the people they'd helped, and anyone who wanted to belong would meet at the community centre for potluck meals that stretched until midnight. Connie had attended 3 so far, bringing her famous apple crisp and sitting with Earl the veteran, Marcus's family, and a dozen others whose lives had intersected with mercy at exactly the right moment. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that matched Hemingway's fur, Rowan settled into the chair beside Connie. They sat in comfortable silence, watching fireflies begin their nightly dance in the yard. "You changed us, you know," Rowan said eventually. "I didn't do anything. You let us help. That's harder than it sounds. Most people would rather suffer in silence than admit they need someone, pride masquerading as strength, but you gave us permission to matter, to be useful in ways that count." Connie looked at this man who'd become family, this stranger who'd heard her desperate goodbye in a veterinary clinic and decided she deserved better. "I thought I'd become invisible. Like the world had moved on and forgotten people like me existed." "The world forgets what it's allowed to forget," Rowan said. "Our job is to remember, to show up, to prove that age doesn't diminish worth, and that every life, human or feline, matters enough to fight for. You did that. You all did." We did it together." Hemingway, hearing his name in the flow of conversation, lifted his head from his investigation of a suspicious leaf. He stared at them with the imperious expression cats perfect over centuries of domestication, yawned with majestic indifference, and returned to his very important work of existing. Connie laughed. "He has no idea he's a hero." "Best kind," Grizz called from the driveway, loading tools into his truck. "Heroes who don't know they're heroes, just living their lives, being themselves, and changing everything anyway." As evening deepened, the bikers began departing, engines rumbling to life, headlights cutting through twilight, waves and promises to return soon. Kestrel hugged Connie goodbye, Grizz saluted with his typical dramatic flair, and Rowan lingered last. "You good?" he asked. "Better than good," Connie said truthfully. "Better than I've been in years." "Good, because we're planning a summer ride to the state park, and you're coming. We'll put you in the sidecar." "I'm not riding in a sidecar." "We'll see," Rowan grinned, pulling on his helmet. "Stubborn woman." "Insufferable man." He mounted his bike, engine purring to life with that distinctive Harley rumble. Before pulling away, he looked back at her one more time. "Remember, Connie, you're not alone anymore. You've got 101 reasons to believe that." She watched him ride away, taillights disappearing down Oakmont Drive. Around her, the neighborhood settled into evening rhythms, porch lights flickering on, television glow through windows, the distant bark of a dog. But it felt different now, less empty, less abandoned. Inside, Connie made tea and settled into her recliner. Hemingway immediately claimed her lap, purring with the volume of a small engine. She stroked his head, feeling his warmth, his aliveness, his stubborn refusal to surrender to the odds. "We made it," she whispered to him. "Both of us." Outside, spring continued its patient work of renewal. Grass growing, flowers blooming, the world turning green again. And in Constance Merriweather's heart, something that had withered during the long winter of loneliness began to grow again. Hope, not the desperate kind that clings to impossible outcomes, but the steady, reliable kind that comes from being seen, being valued, and discovering that family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's the strangers who refuse to let you fall. Sometimes it's 101 motorcycles rolling down your street because someone decided you mattered. And that's a promise worth keeping, not just for a season, but for a lifetime. Thank you for watching this story unfold. If it moved you, if it reminded you that goodness still exists in unexpected places, hit that subscribe button and join us for more journeys where faith is tested and restored. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what moment touched you most. We read every single one, and your stories inspire ours. Until next time, ride safe, stay kind, and remember, you're never as alone as you think. There's always someone willing to show up if you let them. See you on the next ride.